Hi, this is Konstantin. In this tutorial, I want to teach you in depth about Workflower. However, you don't have to watch the whole video. You can of course skip certain parts as well. Just choose what you're interested in, as all the parts are built in quite a modular manner. Alright, so without further ado, let's jump right in. So yeah, the first thing I want to show you is how to install the script itself. So you got your download, you got the JSX bin file of Workflower. Then you just go to copy, and then you go to the After Effects scripts folder, which is, under program files, Adobe, After Effects, support files, scripts. On Mac, it's a bit different. And it's important that you don't put it into the script UI panels folder, where most of the scripts go, but just under the scripts folder itself. So I'm just going to paste it here. Just make sure that it has to be at the top, at least top 20 scripts. So if you have other scripts that name-wise would be before that, it wouldn't work. Also, it's important that you never rename the file itself. That's also why when you get an updated version, you get a file with the same name, and then to update, you just have to copy it into this folder again and overwrite the existing Workflower file. And another thing to keep in mind, don't use the scripts folder that's under app data. You need this folder where you need the administrator privileges to put it into. And that's pretty much it. Now you just have to start or restart After Effects to use it. Alright, now we're in After Effects, and what you have to do now is go to File, Scripts, and then go to Workflower. And if you don't have it enabled, it will show you an error message that you have to make sure that scripts are allowed to write files and can access the network. So hit OK and click on Allow Scripts to write files and access network. Hit OK. Then it thanks you for using Workflower. And it asks you whether you want to enable the shortcuts, which is very essential for Workflower. Otherwise, it won't work at all. So click Yes. And if you have the default keyboard layout preset enabled, you will have to switch that because you can't apply the shortcuts to that preset. So click on Create, select another preset. And I'm gonna, create a copy of the default file here. So I'm gonna go to Save As and call this Workflower, for example. Hit OK and hit OK. And now it asks you whether you want to start with Workflower's default shortcuts. Yes, I want that. And then we come to this panel where basically all of the shortcuts are already applied to it, the default ones. This panel will look a little bit different on Mac, and I'll come back later how everything works on Mac, because the way you apply shortcuts also works a little bit different there. Alright, back to the panel itself. This works pretty much the same on Mac and Windows. You can edit your shortcuts here. So just go to the Edit button here and type in the combination of keys you want there. If there's already, something that exists there, it tells you that it already exists. And it's sometimes difficult to tell, which shortcut exists and which doesn't. So if you want to check that, go to Check Possible Combinations. It tells you that you can't edit the shortcuts in the following panel. So we come up to After Effects main panel. And then if we hold on our keys, we can see, which are free combinations available. So, and then just click on Cancel if we found the shortcut we want to use. Then come up to our main panel and, then, just type in the shortcut that we want to use. I don't want anything changed. I think they're perfect. That's why, obviously, that I chose those as the default ones. So yeah, after you're done here, just click on Save. And then it tells you that you will be directed to the shortcuts panel. That's just unfortunately necessary. The only thing you just have to do now is hit OK. And then Workflower shortcuts are applied. So yeah, if we open up a comp and, you see that we can already start on building, our groups and whatever we want to do with Workflower. I'm just using all the shortcuts now, and it works perfectly fine. Just as some background how it works. if we come up to the shortcuts and we go to File, Scripts, we see that all of the shortcuts have been applied to this one script that we put in here. And within the script, it is being decided which shortcut is being pressed. So this is kind of the way it works, and it makes it very easy because you just have this one file. Unfortunately, this is the way it works on Windows. On Mac, due to certain limitations, it doesn't work, unfortunately. So on Mac, it works differently, and I'm going to show you now. It works, in a different mode, so to say. And on Windows, you can select that mode as an alternative, and I'll tell you later why you can use it on Windows in certain circumstances. So if we come up to the main menu, and we go to the settings, and we go to shortcuts, on Windows, we have this drop down here. We don't have that on Mac. On Mac, the only mode available is this individual scripts mode. Let's go to set shortcuts for current layout, and it tells me that I have to restart After Effects as an administrator to be able to do that. On Mac, this isn't necessary. You only have to restart it as an administrator on Windows. The good thing is you just have to do it for setting shortcuts. After that, you can just run After Effects normally. So now we're running After Effects as an administrator, and to set shortcuts on individual mode or on Mac, you will have to go to File, Scripts, and then go to your workflow file. And then you go to the settings, go to shortcuts, and then go to set shortcuts for current layout. Now you see it looks a bit different, and it tells you that you have set 20 of 20 possible shortcuts. This is because, and if we go to the file here and to scripts, unfortunately, you can only set shortcuts for the first 20 scripts here. This is kind of the way After Effects assigns shortcuts to the scripts. So we are kind of limited. So let's say you have other scripts you want to apply shortcuts to. If we go to the shortcuts, you might not want to use 20 possible shortcuts. You can use this drop-down to maybe go to 15 possible shortcuts, or for example, that you would assign workflow shortcuts to. You already see that the number of shortcuts here have been reduced by setting this lower. So if I set it even lower, we see the number of shortcuts get lower as well. In my case, I want to use all the 20 possible shortcuts. So I set it to 20. And then if I go to reset to default, the 20 most important functions will get a shortcut here. Let's say I would want to add another shortcuts to whatever ungroup layers, for example. It tells me that the maximum number of shortcuts is reached. So I would have to, remove a shortcut or something, and then I can add a shortcut here. I don't want that. I'm going to reset it to default again. And then I'm going to go to save. Now it tells me that the shortcut slots have been installed successfully. And if we go to the scripts, we see that 19 other workflow scripts have been installed here, which is 20 in total. And now all the shortcuts will have been applied to those scripts. So if we just restart After Effects, we can use those. So let us just do that. Okay, now we're back, and like I said, at least on Windows, you don't have to run it as an administrator anymore. If we go to scripts, and we see that shortcuts now have been applied to all of our scripts. And if we create a comp here, we can just use all of our shortcuts very easily. So why would you use the individual scripts mode on Windows? In most cases, I would say it makes much more sense to use single script mode. And this is just because you can set more shortcuts. So you can apply to basically to all of workflow functions. But on the other hand, you can also apply shortcuts to other scripts as well. And on individual mode, you're kind of limited to a certain number of shortcuts you can use However, there are some advantages to this, because on single script mode, sometimes you might get an error, because the way it works, like I explained, the script will be called by every shortcut, and then within the script it is being decided which shortcut is being pressed right now. But due to this nature, sometimes there is a little bit of a lag between executing the script and within the script determining which shortcut is being pressed. So sometimes the script might not recognize the shortcut. It's very rare instances, but it might happen. And another problem that sometimes occurs is that within the script, the variable that reads which key is being pressed cannot be read at all. And I don't know why this happens, but for me this happens maybe once every couple of weeks. For me, that's no problem. And if we go to the workflow user guide, this is kind of the error message you sometimes get. And the unfortunate thing with this error message is sometimes you really have to restart your computer. So yeah, every couple of weeks you might have to restart your computer. Like I said, I don't mind that. If you have more of a problem with that, switch to an individual script mode. All right, let's talk about groups. So I have this composition here, and it's a shot from the short film Noctuide by Alexandra Mauritz. We'll look through this window, and I added this glass in front of it. So I tried to keep it as organized as possible, but things can get kind of messy, especially when you're working on more complex compositions in After Effects. So yeah, it would be great to just group certain layers, and this is what you can do with Workflower. So first of all, let's select the border of the window that I built here with some 3D layers. You can come up with the workflow menu by holding Ctrl-Alt-X, or on Mac it's Ctrl and X. And the menu offers access to all of Workflower's functions. You can close it, by the way, just by clicking on the panel itself. However, now we want to click on Create Group. I want to call this border and hit OK. And now you see this group has been created. There's some indent going on, there's some label coloring, and all of the layers outside of this group are being labeled to gray. If you want layers outside of groups to still keep their original color, you can come up with the menu, go to Settings, and go to Color Label Layers Outside Groups to None by default, and uncheck that. In general, I like that because mostly I just work within groups. Now let's create the second group. And this time I'm just going to use the shortcut to create a group. On Windows, that is Shift F1. On Mac, that is Control and 1. So create the group and call it main. And just continue on. Another cool thing about Workflower that you can also create groups within groups. So let me just select those layers here. So they're everything that's, in front of the glass. And those layers here are kind of the reflection. All right, so here we have our beautiful comp. As you can see, it's already much easier to see the structure. So let's say I want to move those layers back into the main group. So I can just move them here. And then what I need to do now, because you see like the indent is still the old one and the label coloring is the old one, I need to refresh the layout. So you can come up with the menu and click on Refresh Layout. Or you can just use the shortcut, which makes much more sense for something you use so often. So if I would move them back inside, then I could just hit Shift Z or Shift Y for German, Shift V for French. Let's say I create another layer here, like a solid, and it also has the wrong label color and the wrong indent, and then I just hit Refresh Layout, and you see it now gets the right indent and the same label coloring. Within Workflower, you can also set the label color. So one thing you could do is just go to the group header and click on, a different color here. And now, if I hit Refresh Layout, then every color within the group will be relabeled. However, it's kind of tedious if you look at that drop down, to kind of imagine the colors all the time. So there's also a different way. If we come up with the menu, you can go to relabel layers, and then you get this dialog here, and you can actually see the colors. And then, I can just select a different color here. And this is with most functions actually in Workflow. You don't have to have the group header selected. You can be basically anywhere in the group and then, execute the function. And this time I'm just using the shortcut, which would be Control Shift and Space or Option and Space on Mac. And then, just set a different color here. Maybe set a different color here. Another cool thing you can do is, expand collapse the group. So if you come up with the menu and you go to expand collapse group, now you have collapsed this group. And you can also collapse the higher group. And I'm just using the shortcut, which is a Shift X. And now the entire group is collapsed. And if I open it back up again, you see it will remember which group was opened and which group has been closed. And I can also select multiple groups and collapse them or open them. If I don't have anything selected and I execute expand collapse group, it will close everything down. And if I press it again, it will open everything at the highest level at least. Let's say I want to move a group. So I have this border group and I want to move it above the on top group here. So your natural instinct would be probably to just grab that group header here and move it up. But you see, you'll get this error message here, which says that this group header has been moved illegally. And so then you might think, all right, maybe I just have to, just select all layers here and move them up. But you'll get this error message again. And this is because the way Workflow works is basically if you toggle the shade layers here, if you toggle them on, you see that there is this group header here and this group footer. And this is basically how Workflow determines where the group starts and where it ends. So you have to have those layers selected as well. But because you generally have the shade layers turned off, you don't see them, so you can't select them. So that's why there's this select group function. So if you come up with the menu, you can go to select group. And you get this little icon there while selecting, so you know, okay, this group now is selected. And now, if I move that up, you see you don't have any problems with that. You can have that closed, for example. You select the group and just hit the shortcut, which is a Shift D. And then I put it here. And now it's inside the main group. One thing about the selecting function, which is different from most other functions, like the relabeling or the expand collapse group, with those you can be anywhere in the group, have any layer selected, and now I can collapse the group and it will be collapsed. However, with the selecting, I'll try to execute it now and it doesn't work. You always need the group header selected for this to work. And this is kind of because, let's say I want to just select this layer and this group. And if I would have it that you can have any layer selected and I would execute select group now, just because glass is part of main group, it would select the entire main group. So we don't want that. One thing about selecting is, let's say I want to select all my layers and I would use the general function here, select all. This wouldn't work because if you look at all the layers that were shade, for example, After Effects won't select those, and you need them either because they're this header and footer, or they're like a layer contained in the group. That's why if you have no layer selected, execute select group, and this will just select all the layers. And now I can copy them, create a new comp, and then just paste it. And then if I hit refresh layout, you see that everything now works perfectly here. And the same just goes for just selecting a group. You can always just do that. Just select your group, then just copy that. And if I go to a new comp, I can just paste it. And always make sure you're not looking at source name, but on layer name, because on source name you won't get the indent and all of that. Let's say I add a layer here, and I refresh the layer, but now I want to rename that layer. Let's say I'm just going to use After Effects renaming tool and say white thing or whatever. I would always have to hit refresh layout again to get the right indent. And this can be kind of annoying to always have to hit that. So there's also another function called, if you come up with the menu, it's called rename layers. And of course, that's also available by shortcut, which makes much more sense. It's just shift return to come up with this renamer. And then I can rename it back to white solid or something. And then you don't have to hit refresh layout again. And it also has some special functions, and I'll get into those special functions later. One thing you can also do with groups is enable or disable them. So with any layer selected in the group, you can come up to the main panel and click enable disable group. Or just hit the shortcut, which is Shift B, and now I can enable or disable it. I can also just come up to this icon here from the group header and disable it, hit refresh layout, and it will disable the entire group. And as you can see, all of the enabled, disabled states will be remembered. And this is also an active thing. So let's say I want to grab those 3 layers here and move them into that group. Then hit refresh layout. You'll see they will be disabled. But if I enable the group again, it will also remember whether they were enabled or disabled. And similarly, if I move them, although they're disabled here, I move them back into that group, for example, they will be enabled as they were before. Another thing is soloing. So come up with the main menu, go to solo group, and now you are just soloing that group. And similarly, you can just disable the icon here and you'll solo or unsolo the group. I think this is very flexible, a very cool thing. You're just working with your layers here and you think, oh man, I just want to see, this specific group. Then just hit the shortcut to solo the group, which is Control-Alt-D or Control-D on Mac. Then work on your layers and then unsolo it again. Also, of course, you can lock groups, so come up with the main menu, and if you hold on Shift, you get these extra options. Unfortunately, on Mac, no new icons will be revealed for that. However, the functions are still there, of course. So hold on Shift and click on Lock Group. And now the group has been locked, and I can unlock it like this again. Let's say I have these group layers here, and I want to move them back into the main group. However, they're at the end of the reflection group here, which is at the end of the main group itself. So if I would just move them outside and then hit refresh layout, you see they will be in no group. So how can you move them into the main group? So there's this function here called ungroup. And if you execute that, you will always move everything just one level upwards. So if I hit that, you see they're now part of the main group. So they have the same label coloring and the indent of that. And the same goes also for groups. So if I select this reflection group and I want to move it outside of the main group, I can just also use the shortcut, which is on Windows Shift H. And now, as you can see, it's outside of the main group. If I close that down, it's outside. There's also another function called dissolve groups, which, just does as you would expect. So I have this reflection group and I would want to dissolve the entire group and, shift all the layers one level upwards. So if I hold on Shift, I can go to dissolve group. And now all of these layers are part of the main group. Also, you can just delete a group. So just come up with the menu and then you have to hold on Alt and you'll get this delete layer clone group. function, which which also has some extra functions I'll get into in later tutorials. So yeah, just delete it, and now it is being deleted. With the delete function, you always need the group header selected. It's not enough to just have one layer that is contained in the group being selected. Just deleting the group itself won't work, and you'll also get another error. If you then hit refresh layout, you'll just ungroup those layers basically and move them one level upwards. And you can also use the shortcut, which is Shift forward delete on Windows or Shift delete on Mac. Okay, now I have an immensely beautiful comp here, and I can show you how to parent layers with that. You can just click on parent layers to group and then hit refresh layout, and now all of the layers contained in the group are parented to the group header, and now I can just move them around very easily. And let's say I have a new layer here and I hit refresh layout. This will also get the parent, as you can see, automatically. And you can also do that whole thing with subgroups. So if I select those here, and those are basically my stars. And as you can see, this checkbox here is already grayed out, parent layers to group, because a higher group is already parenting, so it needs to parent its layers. So if we hit create, you see that all of the contained layers are now being parented to the stars group, and the stars group is parented to the shapes group. And I can continue on. Alright, and now I can just move all of those individually, as well as a whole. If I'm just using the shortcut, it is Shift J on Windows. I can just parent all of that, and I can unparent it. Let's say, okay, I want to move that, further to the stars. So this is more centered, for example. And then I can come up to shapes again and parent the whole thing. And now it's kind of nicely rigged. You can also change the size of this box here. So if we come up to the settings and go to the MISC section, you can go to group header size and maybe, do 100 by 100 as, a regular null object would be, which I think is often totally annoying that you just have this small thing and you can't really grab the whole thing. I find it incredibly annoying. So that's why there is this option to make it bigger, and I think 400 by 400 is actually quite a nice size to grab. So what are other legal parents, so to speak? So you could parent that layer, for example, to that one, and if I hit refresh layout, nothing will change because it is parented to a layer that is contained in the same group, which is fine. However, let's say I would want to parent that, for example, to the background, which is outside of the shapes group. And if I would hit refresh layout, the parent will go back to the stars group. But what if I want to have a layer where I don't want any parent, for example, or I want to have a parent that's outside of the group? Then you can use the function set parent exception layer. So if you come up with the main menu and if you hold on shift, you will have this icon here, set parent exception layer. And now it will be set to none, and this is fine. I can set this parent wherever I want, and it will not cause any problems. And there will always be this X next to it. And I can also just use the shortcut, Shift K. You can also very easily duplicate a group. It won't work if you just select those layers, duplicate them, and then, move them somewhere, because also the additional shide layers won't be duplicated that way. So what you can just do, just select either your group header or layer contained within the group, then come up with the main menu, hold on shift, and then you can click on duplicate group, or just use the shortcut for it, of course. And now the group has been duplicated. The general layout is this indented mode where, you can be very organized. However, let's say I'm dropping these layers inside here. you might work on 2 or 3 layers or something, and then from time to time you would hit refresh layout, and then they will get the indent and the label coloring, which I think is fine, but you will have to hit refresh layout quite a bit. And if you don't want that, there's also another mode available. So if you come up with the main menu and you hold on shift, there's the non-indented layout. So this way, all the layers, they're not indenting. However, especially when you get several layers deep, let's say I'm going even deeper here in terms of what the depth of these groups is. So this is already 2 times deep. It can be kind of difficult sometimes to see where you are. And if you switch back to indented mode, that's much easier to see. When you go to the settings, you can also set your default layout style. Very often when you're working with workflow, there are special characters like we already saw. Let's say this layer here, for example, is a parent exception layer. And then there are also all kinds of layer types we'll get into later. For example, if I merge these mats, you will also get this special character here. Let's say we have a clone layer here. You can also have a group mat, for example, and all of these things. And then if you go to the non-indented mode, there will still be these icons. But let's say you want to write an expression here, and I want to reference another layer. This here, the stripes clone, for example. So I can't really reference that because it has this special character. So I would have to go here, copy the entire name, instead of just typing that. So this is why there's this expression mode. If you hold on Control or if you hold on Command on Mac, you can toggle the expression mode. And this gets rid of all special characters, of all indent. And then you can just very easily reference your layers, and there aren't any special characters that you don't even have in your keyboard. And once I'm finished writing my expressions, I can come back here, hold on Control or Command, and toggle the mode back to our indented mode. And of course, the expression is now being updated. There are some unusable functions in After Effects. And the first, as you already saw, is this shide mode. So you can't really use that anymore. Let's say I want to unshie everything, and if I hit refresh layout, it will turn back to the shy mode. And let's say I want to shy whatever, those layers here. And if I hit refresh layout, they will be unshied immediately. So if you want to get rid of certain layers, I would recommend, just put them into a group or something and close it, and then you don't have to see them anymore. Another thing that's not available anymore are the comments. So if you go to the comment, you see that Workflow uses that to store certain information about the layers. So let's say I have something else here and I hit refresh layout, it will switch back to its default values. Just keep that in mind, especially when you have older projects or something where you work with comments and you kind of need them for whatever reason, and you execute Workflow on that, you will lose all of your comments. There's also another limitation, and this is specifically on Mac. On Windows, there's the advantage that Workflow can use a certain set of special characters that cannot be found on the keyboard to display its icons. On Mac, however, this isn't possible. So if you go to the user guide, you go to layout, and you go to unavailable characters, you see that these certain kind of characters, within these brackets, this P, for example, so if you want to use a P within brackets, you can't use that anymore because Workflow will remove that from all of your layer names. There are also some additional functions within the relabeling tool. If you come up with a tool, you can quickly change the label color itself just by holding down Shift and clicking on the color you want to change. And it will open up this color picker. And then you choose a color you rather want to have, and you see it will have changed that color. However, you see it hasn't applied it to the layer itself. If you want to change the color and also directly apply it, just hold on Control or Command and click on the color. And now I just have changed that. And the cool thing, if we look here, you see that a name already has been applied to that as well. If you don't want the name to be applied automatically, you can just come to the settings and go to the MISC section and enable when changing a label color, ask for a new color name, and then you can type in your own color name for that. Just be aware if you change the color here and apply it directly, that this will change not only the selected group here, but it will of course change every layer that's associated with this predefined color. If you come up to the Relabel panel and you hold on Alt or Option and click on a color, you will be directed to the AE label preferences if you prefer to change the label colors here. There's also another button here, which is called click to not label layers outside groups to none in Active Comp. So let's add some layers here. And if I refresh the layout, you see that all of those will be labeled to none. And most of the time I would say that's what you want, but let's say you work in a very small precomp. I have a precomp here, and let's say I just want to group those two layers. You see that all the other layers will be labeled to none, and with such a small comp I might not want that. So the cool thing about this button here is that you can quickly just change that for every comp individually. So just hit that, and then I can just group those. And all the layers outside will not be labeled to none, whereas in this comp they would be labeled to none. There are also some additional functions with this renamer. So there are these dividers that you can define. So these ones here are basically dividers. And if we come up to the settings, you see that this is the divider, and you can also redefine that divider if you want to. And if I execute rename layers, you see that I will only see the last level of that name. And if I hold on Alt or Option and I go left on my keyboard, I can flip through the naming levels backwards. And if I hold on Alt or Option and I go right on my keyboard, I can flip forward. And now I can just rename this specific level here, hit return. I can also add a new name level if I hold on Alt or Option and if I press up. And I can also just remove a name level by holding Alt or Option and pressing down. And then hit OK. And I can always show the full name as well. And if you hold on Alt or Option and press return, you'll get to the full name. If I press Alt return, I can go back to the split mode. If I go to the settings, I can also change that preference. I can also always just view it in full mode or remember the last choice I made. So you can also rename your layers based on dependency. So what I often do is I have this base layer, and then there are at least 2 or 3 other layers that are kind of connected to that. So one thing is, for example, like a fractal structure. Another thing is a mask. This is kind of the way I would name my layers. So let's say I have 2 more layers, and one layer is the fractal, and one is a structure, I don't know. Just select the base layer, then I'll select my dependent layers, and then I also execute rename layers again. Now the dependent layers will have the base layer name within their name as well. And I can also rename on dependency. So let's say I want to rename that stripe layer. I'm renaming that to not stripes. And then if I hold on Control Alt and hit return, or on Mac Command Option and I'll hit return, you see that all of the dependent layers are now being renamed as well. And this goes for every layer that's on top or below that. However, if I move that way up, so there are 2 other layers in between, and if I'm renaming that to stripes again and I've hit rename on dependency, I will just rename, the ones that are close by. There are also different modes. I would just refer to the user guide, go to renaming and learn on the additional renaming functions. Something that's also automated here. All the time when you have a track mat and you execute rename on dependency, it will rename that to alpha or alpha inverted, whatever the track mat is. So if I set this to alpha mat and I select my 2 layers, it will always rename that to alpha, which I think is kind of neat because very often you're just having some layer here and it's called white solid and whatever, and it's your alpha matte. And you just have to select your two layers, and if you hit rename layers, it will just rename it to alpha. If you don't like that function, you can also come up to the settings, go to naming, and when renaming on dependency, rename all track methods according to their type. You can just uncheck that, and then it will just rename that to whatever is there. So if I rename on dependency this time, it will be renamed to the actual layer name. Another renaming function is rename layers by number. So this is fairly simple. So we have our title animation here, and we have these icons on top of there. And now they're just having their file name, but I just want to name it differently. So I can just rename the first layer to icon 1. And this is the layer I'll also select first. And after that, in order, I'll select all the other layers. And then I come up with the main panel, hold on Shift, and click on rename layers by number. And now all of the layers are just numbered. Okay, now I want to talk with you about cloning. So we have the shot here of the ship floating into the glowing moon. And what I want to do here is create a light wrap around the ship and the wave. In order to do a light wrap, you have to pre-comp your foreground layers and your background layers so they're fit to the comp size, and then you can create a light wrap from that. However, that can be kind of difficult because in this case, for example, I have a 3D camera here and a null object that this is parented to. So I'd have to put that into both pre-comps. But let's say I want to change something, add a new null object to it or something. So I'd have to copy that as well into every of these pre-comps. So yeah, it can be kind of a tedious, annoying process. And pre-comp clones are supposed to solve that. So you don't lose your layers, you can work in your existing pre-comp, and you can update all changes automatically. So how do you do that? First, let's just select the layers we want. So I have this ship here, and I have this wave. So I come up with the menu and go to clone and pre-comp. And I don't want the prime clone enabled, and I don't want the pre-comp transforms to be enabled. And I'll show you later what these parameters mean. So hit OK. And now we see that we have this merged result here. And if we look inside, we see that we have 4 layers here. We have our wave and our ship, as well as the camera and its parent. And if we look inside, we see that everything has been linked by expressions. So that means if I grab the ship here, for example, and I move it around, you see that it will move as well. Also, you can just disable your layers or enable them, and that's also linked by expression. Also, you can enable or disable your effects, and that will update as well. However, let's say you add an effect here, for example. This is not part of the clone because adding an effect cannot be linked by expression. So in that case, if you added some effect or changed a certain parameter that cannot be linked by expression, you would have to hit refresh connections. This is a different refresh than the refresh layout. So with either the clone selected or a layer that is contained in the clone, come up to the menu and go to refresh connections. And now, as you can see, these curves have been added, and if I change them, the layer will also react to that. Now I can, for example, add another effect, and then I would also have to hit refresh connections, and I can do that by using the shortcut, which is Control Alt and Q or Control Q on Mac. Now this effect has been added and I can play around with it. Let's say I want to change the effect structure. So I want to put that after that. However, if I look into the clone, this of course hasn't been changed because also changing the effects order cannot be linked by expression. So in that case, I would also have to hit refresh connections. And then as you can see, it is in the correct order. If you look into the user guide and you go to connections, you see under refresh connections and refreshing precomp clones, all parameters that cannot be linked by expression, and that therefore you would have to hit refresh connections. Also, when you just add parents, for example, if I add a parent here and I parent my ship to that, now the position is completely off in the clone. But if I hit refresh connections again, everything is back to normal. And you see that this parent also has been added to the clone. The clone will collect all parents and also all layers that are referenced by an effect, for example. Like when you create a displacement map and you reference another layer, this will also be added to the clone automatically. Let's say I want to add more layers to this Precomp clone. So if you come up to the effects on the Precomp clone, you'll see that you have certain settings, and I'll get into those later. And you have these effects for every layer that is contained in the clone. And then you can just duplicate that effect. And then using the drop down, you can select this layer, for example. If you hit refresh connections, you see that this now has been added to the clone as well. Another way that is a faster way to add layers to a Precomp clone is just if you select the layers you want to add, and after that, as the last layer, you select your Precomp clone. Then you come up to the menu and you hold on Control or you hold on Command on Mac and you click on Add Remove Layer References. And now, if we look into the clone, we see that all the other layers here have been added as well. You can also just use a shortcut to add layer references. Control-Alt-Shift-I, or on Mac, it's Control and I. You can delete layers again just by selecting them and delete the effect, and then hit refresh connections. And now they're removed from the Precomp clone. Also, there are custom states for every layer. So I can go to the custom state, for example, of the ship here. And I can, for example, unlink the opacity and set it to 50. All right, let's say I want to duplicate this clone. So if I duplicate that and hit refresh connections on that one, and now if I look at the source name, you see that those are two different comps. So if you hit refresh connections, it will of course think that this is a new unique clone and then create a unique clone from that. And now I can of course just customize that. Let's say I just want to have my ship layer. I'm going to remove those. And now on this one, I only have the ship cloned, and on this one, I have all of the other layers cloned as well. But what if I want to duplicate a Precomp clone, but I don't want to make it a unique clone? Then I'm just going to duplicate that layer. And what I have to do then is then come up to all these effects here and just delete them. And now if I hit refresh layout, you see that the C, it will turn into a D, which means dependent clone. And this, of course, is just referencing this clone here. If I want to hit refresh connections on that one, it says that it doesn't have any reference layers. And now I can customize it whatever I want. Maybe I can drag it and do all kinds of manipulations to it. Now I still have this comp here, for example, this Precomp clone, and I don't need it anymore. So I, of course, just want to delete that. But let's say I'm just going to use the regular delete function. And if I'm going to do that, you see, if I come up to my clones, you see that this one still exists here. And we also get an expression error. So you can also just use delete layer clone group, which we already covered in our group tutorial. So I can just use the shortcut for that, which is shift delete. And now the source of this clone also has been deleted. But let's say I just deleted that and I deleted a bunch of other Precomp clones because I, didn't notice I had to delete them, with the special delete function. And I'm getting a few expression errors. So what do you do then? You can come up to the settings, go to cloning, and it tells me that I have 2 unused Precomp clones. And then I can just go to delete Precomp clones. And now I want to clone our background layer. And all of that is contained within this background group. And instead of selecting all the layers I want to have contained, I can also create a group clone. So I can just use the shortcut to create a Precomp clone, which is Control, Alt, Shift, and W, or on Mac, it's Control and W. And I want to create a group clone, but I don't want the prime clone to be enabled. And now the background here has been cloned. However, this is a group clone, so it works differently. So let's say I have this layer here, and I want to add it to the Precomp clone. But it tells me that I cannot add layers to a group clone. So the way a group clone works is that it just grabs all of the contained layers in the group. Let's say I'm adding this layer now to this group, and then I hit refresh connections. Now it will be added automatically to the clone. I can also use delete layer clone group in this case. Then it will update the clone automatically and remove the layer from the clone. Otherwise, if I would just use the regular delete function, you will get an expression error there because this layer, of course, cannot be referenced anymore. Alright, this group clone layer always has to stay within the group itself. So if I would move it into the ship group, for example, and hit refresh connections, it will think it is a group clone from that group. But I want it, of course, to be the clone of the background layer. So I'm going to move it in there, hit refresh connections. So the clone will only grab layers that are below the clone layer. So let's say I'm adding a mat, for example. And I hit refresh connections. It will not collect this mat layer because it is on top of the group clone layer. So yeah, if you want to have your layer contained in the group clone, just put it below the group clone then. There's only one exception. If the group clone itself is a track mat, then the one layer below, the matted layer, won't be added to the group clone. I don't want to show that actually. I just want to use that background layer as a way to create a light wrap. But I want to, of course, I have to move it above the ship and everything else. But since I cannot move a group clone layer out of the group as I showed you, the way I want to do it is to just duplicate that and then just delete all the effects to make it a dependent clone and then move it up here. I'm going to disable the ship clone because I just want to use it, as a mat. I'm going to rename that quickly to light wrap and that to ship reference and just rename on dependency very quickly. And I'm just going to create a group here. Now I'm just going to quickly create the setup for a light wrap. And I'm going to use the ship as a mat. And I'm going to invert it, add a Gaussian blur to it, create a mat again. And now we have created our light wrap very quickly. And now, since everything is linked by expression, I can move all of my layers around. And as you can see, the light wrap will react to that automatically. So I have my camera here that's parented to this null object. Let's say I want to change some camera movement, so I want to add a new null to it and parent that null to that. Now, as you can see, the light wrap is totally out of whack because the transforms don't match anymore. So instead of just finding all of your Precomp clones and selecting them to update them, what you can also do is just deselect all layers and then hit refresh connections. And it will ask you whether you want to refresh all clones, and I want that. And now all clones have been updated with this new parent here. So this clone and this clone as well. Similarly, I can just remove it. And I will, of course, get the expression errors, and then I can hit refresh connections again. There's also a quicker way. There's also a function, if we come up to the menu and hold on Shift, called quick refresh connections. It's a much quicker way to refresh connections. However, there are some drawbacks to it. In a later tutorial, I'll show you how that works. So if I hit that, now this parent will be removed from all Precomp clones. Since everything is linked by expression, it can get a bit slow since expression take a bit of time to calculate. So there's also a way to not link these properties by expression. So let's say I have my clone here and I'm done, I'm finished. I know I don't want to work on that anymore. So I don't need them to be linked. I can also go to link properties via expressions, and I uncheck that and then hit refresh connections. And now if we go inside and look at our layers, we see there are no expressions. Just be aware, of course, if I, move that layer, it will not update when it's unlinked. And I can also just use the dedicated function, since it might take a bit of time to always, go to the layer, then go to this checkbox and hit refresh connections. You can also come up to the main panel, hold on Alt or Option, and click on Link Unlink Properties. And now everything is linked again. And of course, you can also use a shortcut for that, which is Control, Alt, Shift, and 0. If you want to, you can also change the layer order. So you can go to layer order and set it to custom order. And it works by just shifting these effects around. So I'm going to shift them, as I like, and then hit refresh connections. And as you can see now, the layer order has been changed. This can be, for example, useful if you want to create an alpha mat using a Precomp clone. And there's also the possibility to set the blending mode individually, for example, to stencil alpha or to silhouette alpha, and build your custom mat. So what happens to clones when you duplicate your comp? If I want all of these clones to be unique clones, I can just have no layer selected, hit refresh connections, hit OK. And now unique clones have been created here. And as you can see, you have your ship reference and your background group clone, and it tells you that this is in ShotComp 2. If you don't want to have unique clones, but you want dependent clones, just go to the Precomp clones and delete your effects on there, then hit refresh layout. And now all of these, as you can see, are dependent clones. All right, now I want to show you a different kind of cloning, which is called prime clones. So I have this glass group here. So I have some stripes, structure here, and the glass texture. And both are 3D layers that are tracked into the shot. And now I want to add some drops to it. So I have this texture here of these drops that are also tracked into the shot. And I have my main footage here. And I added a bit of color correction to it. And now I want to create a bump map from this drops texture onto that, so that the background kind of, shines through these drops. However, since this isn't at comp dimension, it won't be able to reference that, so we have to precomp that. However, compared to the precomp clones we saw before, this time I don't want this layer to appear within the shot other than from the precomp layer itself. So if I go to clone layer, I can enable the prime clone on this one, and I'm going to hit OK. And you already see that it looks a bit different. The contained layer now has this dot in front of it. And every of the layers that have this dot, they are contained within a prime clone. And let me just reveal the opacity. So we see that the contained layer has an opacity of 0, and the clone layer has an opacity of 100. However, we obviously still see this texture, and we can control the opacity via this slider up here. And you already see I can dial it up or down. And although the opacity is set at 0% here, if we look into the clone, it will have the opacity that we defined right here. This has the advantage that I'm seeing what the clone sees, But since the layer also is still enabled, I can move it around. And remember, the only thing we're seeing right now is the clone layer. Let me just create the bump map now. So I'm using CC Glass for it. And I'm going to reference the drops texture. Alright, now we're already getting like a very drop-like effect here. Now I'm just going to duplicate that drops texture, make it a dependent clone, and use it as a track mat for that layer. Rename it. Okay, now I want to lighten this part here because there's, light coming through the window here. So what I'm going to do is create an adjustment layer. And then I'm going to create a mat for the window area here and grab the transforms of that layer here. Now I'm just going to mask it. But I also want to use these drops here as a second alpha. And for that, I'm going to use another function, which I'm going to talk about later, which is merge mats. And with that, we can merge several mats into one track mat. I'm just going to speed up this part because we're going to talk about it later anyway. Now everything is matted and I can add curves to it here. And now I'm just brightening that area here. Alright, one thing I want to do now is create a camera lens blur to the whole group here. So how am I going to do that? You can stack your prime clones on top of each other. So we have this one prime clone here, but we can potentially stack this indefinitely. So we can, for example, select all of the layers, and I'm going to go to clone, enable the prime clone, hit OK. Let's get this to screen. Now, as you can see, all of these contained layers have this dot here, and the one from the drops texture is indented even further, which shows that it's one level deeper. And you can stack your prime clones. You can, if you want to, you can also clone that again and stack these clones on top of each other. I don't want to use that. In fact, I actually want to use a group clone in that case. So I'm going to delete that for now, create a clone here, enable prime clone, set this to screen, and I can add a camera lens blur here. Alright, now we have added a camera lens blur to all of the contained layers. And the cool thing, even with this camera lens blur here on top of it is, I can, move all of the layers around. So for example, I want to change the drops texture here. And everything will update in all the higher clones as well. Or I can, shift the window area here around. And this is so much better than having to go through levels and levels of pre-comps and changing something, then not knowing how it works, in the higher comps and all of that stuff. So let's say I want to change the opacity of that brightening here, for example. Of course, if I'm gonna hit T, I can't change it because it's set to 0. So every time I'd have to come up to the effects panel and change it up here. There's also a quicker way though. If you want the slider to be revealed in the timeline, you can also hit a shortcut, which is Alt F1 or Control 3 on Mac. And then you can set it to 50 or, 75 or something. With a layer that is not a prime clone source layer, it will just reveal the regular opacity slider. If I want to add an effect, for example, to a contained layer here, and I'm going to create curves, and I want to change something, of course, we don't see anything right now because it is not part of the clone layer. So I have to hit refresh connections, and then it will update. However, if you're working on your clone layers, this can be sometimes a bit annoying, always having to hit refresh connections. So there's also a different way on how to work on it. On the clone layer, you can come up to the settings and click on show layers. And if I hit refresh layout, we now see the original source layers. So the clone layer here is set to 0% opacity, and the contained layers, as you can see, are set to their actual opacity here. What you can also do is hit Control-Shift-Return or Control-Return on Mac. And this will now hide all the layers. And now I can show them again, and I can select any of the layers. I don't have to have the group clone layer selected, and then hit the shortcut to show clone layers. And now they're being shown, and it's also indicated which layers are being shown by this marker. And now I can come up to my drops effect, maybe add like hue and saturation. Then I can work on several layers, and when I'm finished, I'm just gonna hide my layers again, and it's being updated to the clone then. If you execute show clone layers, you see that we are showing the layers that this clone has, but we're not showing this drops texture here because it's one level even further. So I would have to hit show clone layers here. And now I can show that texture as well. You already know that you can enable or disable your layer, and it will be linked by expression and live update. Similarly, you can also enable or disable your effects, but you can also solo them. So if I'm just soloing that layer, of course, I'm not seeing anything since this is at 0% opacity and I'm just seeing the group clone. However, if I'm going to hit refresh layout, workflow will automatically also solo the clone that the layer that is soloing right now is contained in. And then I can also add my other clone layers, and that way I can solo or unsolo them. If I'm not soloing anything, it will show the entire clone. So I have this shot here, this drone shot, and let's say we want to add a texture to that rooftop here. So I have tracked this. I did a 4-corner pin track with Mocha here. So let's bring in a texture here. So I have this grunge texture here, and let me just scale it down. I'm going to set the transform mode to multiply, and let's add some curves to it. Let's transform it a bit. All right, I'm going to put this into a group. Okay, and now I want to apply the 4-corner pin track to it. In order to do that, everything has to be fit to the comp size. So I'm just going to create a group clone from this texture group. And in this case, I want to enable the prime clone. And I also want to enable the Precomp transforms, but I'm going to disable it now to show you basically the difference. So let us first set the clone to multiply as well. And if we look at the transforms, we see that they're all locked. Even if I would want to move the Precomp, I couldn't do it. And this is so you don't move it by accident. However, if I enable the Precomp transforms and I hit refresh connections, we see that now we can move it around. And also another cool thing, we see that this layer here that is contained in there has been parented to the clone. So we can move it around, rotate it, whatever. And this layer will always be at the right position here because it is parented to the group clone. This, however, only works with 2D layers. If you have a 3D layer, the position will be off. It only will work if you have the Z position set at 0. That layers will be parented to the clone only is the case when you use prime clones. When you use regular Precomp clones, you can enable the Precomp transforms, but the contained layers just won't be parented to it. All right, now we're ready to apply the corner pin to our group clone. So I'm going to select it, apply it, enable the motion blur. And now we see that it matches and it's tracked in. Now let's quickly create a mat for it. And I want to apply the corner pin also to that. Now we can just roto it. And we see now it all works perfectly. And at any point in time, we see we have our texture here and we can move it. And we can also very easily now add another texture to it. So now I'm dropping this texture into it. And let me just show the layers now. Okay, let's scale it down and add some curves to it. And now what we have to do now is hit refresh connections. And since it is a group clone, it automatically added this layer to our clone. So let's hide our layers again and show the Precomp clone. Alright, and now we have added another element. What you can also do is set a custom size for your Precomp clone. So what I have here in our background is the stage. And then I have this guitar guy, which I keyed out. And now I want to create a shadow that's coming from these lights. So what I'm going to do is duplicate that layer. And what I want to do with that is use a corner pin effect. However, with the corner pin effect in After Effects, it's kind of annoying because there are no from pins. And this is a bit larger actually. So it would be kind of messy having to fiddle with that. What you can do, for example, is create a precomp and make the precomp smaller and then use the corner pin effect on that. Well, let me just call that shadow base. And now I'm going to create a precomp clone. I want the prime clone to be enabled and also the precomp transforms. And now it's been fit to the comp size. However, I want the precomp size to be a custom size. And then you can go into the custom precomp size settings. And in order to know how big the new precomp is going to be, I'm going to come up with the settings, hold on Alt or Option, and then you can click on Preview Custom Clone Size. And now, if I move those parameters, you see that I'm getting, an indication of how big this precomp is going to be, so that it fits right around that guy. And then if we hit Refresh Connections, you see that this precomp now has this new size. Okay, now let's move our guy on top. Now I'm going to grab my shadow here and move it into place. I'm going to reverse it. And then I'm going to grab my power pin. Now I'm going to add a fill to it. And I'm going to set it to multiply. I'm going to call this left shadow. Then I'm going to create the right shadow. So duplicate that. And I'm going to delete the settings and the cloned layer effect. So I can make it a dependent clone. Alright, looking good so far, I think. Of course, this part here would need a little bit more work. So another thing I would like to do now is to create some displacement here, that the background is kind of displacing that shadow. So in order to do that, we will have to create a precomp clone from the whole background. And I don't want the prime clone or the precomp transforms to be enabled this time. So I'm going to disable that. I'm going to duplicate it and remove all my settings. And I'm going to call this Luma Matte. And then I can customize it a bit. Basically try to grab as much of the structure here so we get a lot of information for displacement. Now I'm going to disable that. I also, of course, have to create a precomp clone from these two here. So I'm going to grab these two layers here, create a precomp clone. This time I want the prime clone to be enabled, but no precomp transforms this time. I have to set the blending mode to multiply as well. And then I can create a displacement map. Select this Luma Matte here. And maybe create a Gaussian blur to it a bit. And maybe also to the matte itself. Now maybe we'll have to move these two ones a bit down here. Alright, certainly it doesn't win an award for best visual effects as of now. But you see that, yeah, it was fairly simple to do all of that using precomp clones. Alright, now I want to show you a different mode of cloning, which is called Clone in Comp. And it has some advantages and also some disadvantages compared to a precomp clone. I have this example here of this also immensely beautiful comp, of course. And it's this triangle going around these cubes. And these cubes are generated by CC Particle World. This triangle should be in front of the particles at first, and then it's supposed to be behind that. But because this is a 2.5D effect, this 3D layer won't interact with that and it cannot go behind that. What you could do now, for example, is create a clone and comp. And a clone and comp only works on single layers. So you cannot clone multiple layers. You can come up to the main menu, hold on Shift, and then go to clone and comp. And then you can use the RGBA or the alpha only. I'm going to select RGBA, and I don't want to split source and clone at the current time right now. And now I have created this perfect clone of this triangle here. And the cool thing about a clone and comp is that I can add any effect to it. Or even if I add a mask to it. So let me just look at the clone, and you see all of these things have been updated to that. So everything that you add with effects will update automatically. So I don't have to hit refresh connections anymore, which is pretty cool. And this is just like a general calculations effect on it. And it will have inherited all the transforms of the other layer. But there's still a need for refresh connections. So let's say I want to enable motion blur. This, of course, cannot be replicated. So I would have to hit refresh connection. And as you can see, now the blur also has been created there. The same goes for a parent. If I would want to parent that, then I would have to hit refresh connections again. And now the clone also has this parent. So I'm just going to delete that for now because I want to use a different setting. So I'm going to go to the part where this triangle has to go behind these boxes. So it should be somewhere around here. Then I can also just use the shortcut, which is Shift-N. I'm going to select RGBA again, but I'm going to select split source and clone at current time. And then I'm going to set it to split source by opacity. And now this clone here has been created with the in point at where, the current time is. And then I can just move it behind the particles. And then if I go to the main layer here and I look at the opacity, it will be set to 0. And if I go one frame before that, it's 100. And that way, which is pretty cool, now, first of all, you see it's going behind that because, of course, the clone, this is the one that's being visible here. But the cool thing is, just because it's been this layer only has been set to 0% opacity, but it's still enabled, I can still move it around and switch things up on there. And it will live update on the clone layer that is being visible here. And if I want to change the in point of that, for example, to maybe here, then I have to grab these keyframes here and move them right there. And now it will work without a problem. Another time when cloning and comp might be really useful is when you want to use it as a track mat. In this case, I want to create like a light edge for that guitar guy here. Go to clone and comp. I'm going to select alpha only. And I don't want to split source and clone at the current time right now. And now we have this perfect mat. And this time it's just using the set mat effect. And then I want to duplicate that actually again. And I'm going to set the fill to, some color here. And then I want to set this to alpha inverted. And I'm going to grab a transform effect here and position that down. Maybe add like a Gaussian blur to it. Set it to add maybe. If you reveal the opacity for a clone and comp, this cannot be manipulated because there is an expression applied to it. And this is because when you come to the source of the clone, you will also have these clone and comp settings here. And you can set the clone opacity, for example. You can say it's custom on each clone. And you will also have this slider up here. So I can set it to 50 maybe, or even lower. And in this case, you can also use the reveal layer opacity shortcut. And then you can set the opacity for this specific clone. Or if you have multiple clones, you can set maybe custom for all clones if you want to. and then you can control all of your clones. But in this case, I don't want that because this one is supposed to be at 100, of course, and this one at 25. So I'm just going to set it to custom on each clone. And the cool thing is that now everything is linked to that base layer. So let's say I'm creating like a mask here. Of course, that doesn't make sense at all. But you see that this light edge will react to that automatically. So there are different ways of refreshing connections. You already know the regular refresh connections. So I'm coming up to this layer here again, and I want to add some levels, for example. Of course, it won't show up here, and then I'm going to hit refresh connections. However, as you see, this takes a little bit of time. And this is because the way refresh connections works is that it will go into the group clone, delete all of the layers, copy all of the layers back into the comp and link them up. So there's also a different mode. So I'm just going to delete that. Let's say I'm adding it again. And if I come up to the menu and hold on Shift, I can click on Quick Refresh Connections. And as you see, it's way faster because the way Quick Refresh Connection works is that it won't delete all of the layers. It will keep them within the clone, but it will check every layer for its attributes, and whether something changed, then it will update that layer to that new state. In most cases, it should be faster. However, let's say you changed 100 parameters or something, then it could be that it's slower because it has to change all of these parameters then. However, there are also a few drawbacks to quick refresh connections. That's why it's not the default way to refresh connections. That's why it's just for users that know what they're doing. Quick refresh connections will be able to refresh most of the attributes. You know, all of the data that's inside an effect here, for example. However, with these layer indexes, so this one will work, but this drop down here, the source mask, effects and masks drop down, unfortunately, you cannot access that via scripting, so the function won't know whether anything changed there. That's why when you hit quick refresh connections, always the selected layers, they will be copied into the clone comp completely and linked up, and all of the other layers that are not selected will be checked for their changes, like I explained. So when you have an effect like this here, this is a problem, but also when you have effects, for example, that have like a unique UI, like let's say Element 3D or optical flares or something, this also won't be readable by quick refresh connections. If you come up to the user guide and you go to connections, then you go to quick refresh connections, you can also read up on the drawbacks to it. But for everyone that wants to refresh and refresh quicker and that knows what they're doing, I would always recommend quick refresh connections. There's also a shortcut for it, so I'm going to delete that and I want to update that layer. So I'm going to hit Alt F2, or on Mac it's Control 2. And there's an even quicker way to refresh your connections than using quick refresh connections, and that is the quick refresh connections that is built into refresh layout. Alright, now it all gets quite confusing. That's why this option isn't enabled by default. But if you're interested, you can come up to the settings, go to cloning, and here's this option. When executing refresh layout, quick refresh clone connections of selected layers. So you can check that, hit save. So what will it do? It's basically quick refresh connections, but whereas the other refresh connections will always update the entire clone comp, this time only the selected layer will be refreshed and nothing else. However, in most cases, I would say this is what you want. You make a little change, you add an effect, you change to the blending mode, and you want to see the result. And then you can just execute refresh layout. Let's just add curves here, for example. I'm going to hit refresh layout, and now it's already there. You can delete it, hit refresh layout. I can change the blending mode of that, and then it's already there. But the drawback, of course, is let's say you work on several layers here and you forget to execute refresh layout, and then you're just executing it, while on that layer. And then you have these other two layers that have not been refreshed, and you're wondering why is the clone not updating correctly. There's also one other drawback to this function, and it has to do with the drawback I already covered within quick refresh connections. I told you that within the regular quick refresh connections, the selected layer will always be copied to the clone comp and linked up completely. However, this is not the case with the quick refresh connections within refresh layout, just to keep it as fast as possible. So just be aware that this drop-down source mask effects and masks might not update correctly. Let's say you're experiencing some difficulty, something isn't updating correctly. I would always advise you to use the regular refresh connections then once, and then everything will be updated, and after that you can continue using your quick refresh connections. If you look into the user guide and you go to layout, you can also go to quick refresh clone connections of selected layers within the refresh layout function, and there you can also read up a bit about its limitations. Another thing you can do with Precomp clones is you can create 3D Precomp clones. This, as of now, is in beta, so there are some drawbacks. So I would just refer to the user guide, go to cloning, go to 3D Precomp clones, and it tells you that there are quite a few drawbacks. They're also not enabled by default, but if you still want to use them, just come up to the main menu, go to cloning, and click on Use 3D Precomp clones. I'm going to hit Save. And this only applies to prime clones. So if I just create a prime clone, and also another important thing is it has to have its Precomp transforms enabled. And then I'm gonna click on the 3 layer switch for the clone, and I'm gonna hit refresh connections. And as you can see, the contained layers all have been turned into 3D. And if we look at the position of them, we see that the Z position for all of these layers has been set to 0. This is so that we can grab our comp here, scale it for example, shift it back, and we can't really move them in the Z position because they're of course stuck to this plane that is the Precomp clone. And now we can just move it around and also of course move them in the X and Y position. If you want to rotate them, it is important to set your rotation not to orientation, because the orientation also is locked because we're just using the 2D rotation, which is the Z rotation. So always set it to rotation. If you were to have your collapse transformation switch enabled, and I hit refresh connections, now we can also move them in the Z position. And we have our Precomp clone here and can move it around and still work on our layers here. If I disable that again and I hit refresh connections, they're all locked again in the Z position. Sometimes you may want to have the collapse transformation switch enabled, sometimes not. Let's say I'm adding a roughen edges effect on here. I crank it up and then I move it around. That stays in place. However, if I enable the collapse transformation switch, we have to turn it down a bit more. If we move it around, the structure itself will not move with the layers. Very often you just want to create like a very quick mat. So, and you just have to create a new solid, then hit OK, then go to the modes and then go to alpha mat. I mean, it's fine, and now you have your mat. But, you know, it are a few steps, and it's something you just do so often. So there is now this option. If we come up to the menu and click on Create Mat, it's just a quick mat created to the layer. And there is also, of course, a shortcut, which is Ctrl-Alt-Z, or on Mac, Ctrl-Z. By default, it's set at double the size of the current comp. So this is because, let's say this is parented to something. So there is some extra space, because very often then you will hit the border and it's not matting anymore. If you want the same as the comp size or even more, you can go to settings, matting, and set the default mat size here. By default, the collapse transformation switch is on. You can also change that. You can also create a multi-layer mat. So I can just select all of these 3 layers here and then hit create mat, and I'm gonna call this shapes, for example. You can either use a custom mat layer or a mat from comp. I also wanted double the size and enable the collapse transformation. And now you see that we have this multi-layer mat here, and it's matting to all layers. And there are also some extra functions. You can set it to either stencil alpha or silhouette alpha, set the opacity, invert it. Also in and out points are being respected. Let's say I already have a mat. So this circle, for example, I have created already a mat here. Now if I select these 3 layers and I hit create mat, hit OK. Now you see that this mat still exists, and I can create a new mat here, and I can merge these mats on top of each other. Later I show you how that works, because that is the merge mats function. I can use a multi-layer mat, or I can just use a group mat. So with the group header selected, I'll hit create mat, and similarly I can mat this. The advantage of using a group mat, of course, is if I add another layer here and I hit refresh connections, now this will be matted as well. You can delete a group mat just by selecting the group header again and executing create mat. What will also work is group mats within group mats. So here I have 2 groups. So I'm creating a mat here. And I can create another group mat within this group. And now only the layers contained in there get this group mat. I can also use external layers for a group mat. In this case, I have these water stripes basically that I animated and that are supposed to go up while the wave also forms. However, they now have to be matted to the wave, because as of now, as you can see, they go outside of it. And what I also want, I just want them to be, at the edges here where it's brighter. So I want to create a luma mat from the wave. I'm just going to select these wave layers here, and I'm going to create a Precomp clone. I don't want a prime clone. Hit OK. Now I can use that as a luma mat. I'm going to hit create mat. And as it's the mat layer, I'm going to choose this luma here, and I'm going to hit refresh connections. For everyone that didn't watch the tutorial on clones yet, this is a different refresh than the refresh layout, so don't confuse them. And now it's just using the stencil alpha, but because of that, it's still going into, these areas where I don't want them. So I'm setting this to stencil luma. And now it's just matting, to the outside of this wave. And I can turn the mat on and off by clicking on the effect switch here. Alright, yeah. Looking good, nice and subtle, but it really adds, to the movement of the wave, I think, here. Okay, now I want to talk with you about how to merge mats. So we have this shot here of this woman walking towards that car. And what I want to do there is create like a bit of a grunge texture on that bus here. So in order to do that, first I've, tracked the shot. In order to make a mat for the texture, I already keyed this bus here to make it easier. Now let's put in our texture, scale it down, change the blending mode to multiply. Okay, now I want to create the mat for it. So we have this key here, but we also need another mat to kind of mask the area that we want to use of that key here. And I want to parent that to the track. In order to do that, we need to create a new layer, and I'm going to hit OK. I'm going to call this area. Mask that out here. Okay, we can parent the whole thing, and then we see it will move with the track. We can also set it to collapse transformation, because later when we perform merge mats, it will create the calculations effect. And it's always easier to have it on collapse transformation, because then you can very easily reference that layer with all its transforms. It's also possible to do it without collapse transformation. but it will get a bit trickier, and I'll show you why in a second. So I'm going to deactivate the matte layers for now, and I'm going to select the texture first. And after that, I'm going to select all the layers that I want to merge. So you can either already have a track matte to your layer and then select that track matte and the layers you want to add to it. Or if you don't have a track matte as of now, you can just select your base layer as the first layer, and after that you select all the layers you want to matte to it. And I have deactivated those, and in a second I'll show you why I did that. And now if we come up to the main panel and hold on Shift, we can click on Merge Mattes. And now we have merged our mattes. On top of that, we have what is called a matte collection group. You can identify that by that triangle here. And if we look inside, we have our two mattes here. And they're both enabled now. However, their opacity is set to 0%. And the good thing is that now, just because they're still enabled, we can move them around and thereby change the matte. And we can see here in the matte layer settings that the opacity is not set to from this layer, but to custom opacity. And this is defined here. So we can also move that around. We could also, for example, set it to the matte merge layer effect. And this is if we go to our matte merge layer here, we see that this also has an opacity slider here, and we can move that around. However, in this case, I want to set it to custom opacity. Hey, so sorry to interrupt, he is Konstantin from the future, and I wanted to show you a little feature I added in the meantime actually. So when you go to your layer now, to your matte layer, you see in the matte layer settings, you now have these two extra checkboxes, which is called invisible matte and show matte. And this means that the opacity is still set to 0%, but before that, if you wanted to see your key layer here, of course I would see nothing and I would have to dial up the opacity. Now you just have this checkbox, so very quickly you can just show your matte again and then uncheck it if you don't want to see it again. And this happens to every layer that is put into this collection group here, that this will be turned into an invisible matte. However, you can of course enable it for any other matte layer that you're referencing with the matte merge. But I'll talk more about layers and matte collection groups and other matte layers in a later part of this tutorial. Just one little thing to know, with the opacity it will always be by default will be set to custom opacity. You can set it to from matte merge layer effect as well. However, you cannot set it to from this layer. It will turn back to custom opacity then because of course this the opacity of this layer will always be set at 0%. Alright, so this has been it from the future. So back to my older self then. Now let's look at our matte here. So this is the matte merge layer, and at first we see this is the key. And it was able to reference that key layer because it had the same transforms. So this is the key, and it's set to stencil alpha. The second, by nature, is always set to normal, so it adds to that matte. However, we don't want that, we want to stencil that. So we can go to the blending mode and set it to stencil alpha. We could also set it to silhouette alpha if we want to, but I want to set it to stencil alpha. And now we have created this matte successfully. Oops, I see the texture of course has to be parented to the track. Alright, let me just quickly add some curves here. Maybe add like a Gaussian blur to it. But now I want to create a third matte to everything. And I want to make a bit of a gradient here. So it kind of falls off. So the grunge texture kind of loses opacity towards the top. However, this time I want to do this with the roughen edges effect. And because this area layer is parented to the track, but we set it to collapse transformation. That's why it's easy for that calculations effect to, just reference that and also have all the transformations referenced. However, let's just do that as an example. If we were to have a layer here and we have our roughen edges effect on it, and this is parented to the track, and we have our collapse transformation on, let's look at it. We see that the structure itself won't move because every effect you apply to a layer with collapse transformation the effects will be built on top of that, but not before the transformations. However, if we don't collapse the transformations and we move it around, you see that the structure will move with the layer. And this is what we want. Either you can just have a layer here and add it to the mud merge layer. Just doing it as an example here. First select the mud merge layer, then the second layer, and then execute merge mats, which you can do by holding down Ctrl Alt Shift Z. And now it has been added here as an effect. However, there's also a quicker way. You can select either your base layer or the mud layer and then execute create mat on it. And now we can name it to border, but we want to disable the collapse transformation with this one. And now it has been added, but you already see on top of here a new mud collection group has been created. And if I open that up, this clone layer is inside of there. And if we look at the mud merge layer, the reference layer for the border layer, it's not this one. But if we look here, it's the clone layer. And this is because with a layer that doesn't have collapse transformation on, but we still want the transforms to be at the right position, we need to create a precomp clone because the precomp clone is fit to the comp size. And this is every time we don't have a layer that's neither on the comp size level, nor it is with collapse transformation. So now with this layer here, I can just create this border. And now I can add the roughen edges. And of course, nothing is visible right now because I have to hit refresh connections. And now we have added this. We can crank this up a bit, scale it down. And then we can come up to the mat layer and set this to silhouette alpha, for example. We also have to parent it to our track. And of course now, because that's not part of the clone, we have to hit refresh connections again. And now everything is referenced and everything works out fine. This mud merge collection group always has to be on top of everything. If you want to move your layer around, you have to select all of these 3 layers here. Then of course hit select group to move it around. Why does it have to be on top of there? So let's say I have a new layer here I want to add to the mud merge. If you want layers to be added to the mud collection group, you always have to have the layer directly above the mud collection group and it needs to be disabled. So now if I first select the mud merge layer and then the layer I want to add to it and hit merge mats, you see that it will be added to this layer here and it will also be added to the mud merge collection group. However, let's say it would be somewhere here and I would reference it. It will be added to the mud merge layer here, but it won't be added to the mud merge collection group. And this is because sometimes you just want to reference a layer that is not specifically a mat for this base layer here, but it's just a general layer within your comp. Also, if the layer is enabled and it's directly above, it also won't be put into the mud collection group. It always has to be disabled. If you don't like the whole concept of mud merge collection groups and all of that stuff, you can come up to the settings, go to matting, and uncheck collect merged mud source layers and group above mudded layer. You can also convert your groups. So let's say you have a group and you don't want this to be a mud collection group anymore, then you can just select it and execute merge mats on it. And that way you see we have now lost this icon here and turned it into a regular group. And the same goes if you just do that again and you get this icon again and now it's a mud collection group. Mud collection groups are also unique in the sense that their label color cannot be changed. So I can change that, but it won't have any effect. But if I change the actual group color, the label of the contained mud collection group will be changed as well. Let's say you, for example, change a name. You don't call this border, but rough and edge or something. And then you go to your mud merge layer. The effect itself still will be called border. And it's a bit difficult sometimes to see which layer you're actually referencing, because by this drop down, it's kind of difficult to see. And sometimes it's also just the clone layer. So in order for that effect to have an updated name, you just select your mud merge layer and then execute merge mats. And that way, as you can see, the name has been updated. Now let's talk about adjustment layers. So I have this shot here of this woman walking, and I added these 3 bushes here that are 3D layers and that are positioned into space. Of course, the shot is 3D tracked. And now I want to color correct all of these 3 bushes here with 1 color correction. And of course, it would be nice just to add an adjustment layer here and add curves. However, now I'm also brightening the background here. So it would be really nice just to add an adjustment layer only to selected layers. So what you can do using Workflow is you select your layers, then you come up with the main menu and you go to create linked adjustment layer. And now we have an adjustment layer here, and on it are 3 effects, and all these effects are referencing the layers that we, had selected. First, let me just rename the name to bushes. And now I can add curves, for example. But if I change something, nothing happens. So what we have to do is execute refresh connections. If you haven't watched my video on clones yet, just be aware that this refresh connections is a different refresh than the refresh layout, so don't confuse them. All right, let's execute it then. And now if we change something, we see that all of the layers are updating. And what happened is that this effect has been copied to all of these layers here, and you see that it has been added after all their internal effects. And yeah, of course, everything is linked by expression. And I can also add another effect here, hue and saturation. Of course, it's doing nothing as of now. Now I hit refresh connections. And now this one has been added as well. I can disable the effect and enable it, and it's also linked by expression. The same goes for the whole layer, so I can enable, disable it. Also, if I, of course, change up the structure here, I have to hit refresh connections again in order for that to update on the layers. Another thing, you can, of course, also adjust the opacity of all the contained effects up here. If you look at the transparency of the layer, it's always set to 0 and there's an expression on it. However, you can similarly just reveal this opacity slider here by hitting reveal layer opacity. And then I can switch up that as well. Let's say I want to add a new layer to it. So if I duplicate that and hit refresh layout, the effect will disappear on that freshly duplicated layer. And let's say I move it around and I want to add like a new bush back there. And if I want to add this layer to our adjustment layer, I can just first select the layer I want to add, then the adjustment layer, and then execute add layer references. So it works exactly the same as you would add layers to a clone. You could also just, work with these effects here. So I could delete that, for example, hit refresh connections. Then this layer here won't have an effect anymore. And I could also, if I duplicate that, add this the same way. One thing now with these layers is that they are a bit too sharp, because the general footage just is a little bit unsharp. What I want to do now is add a Gaussian blur to it. Hit refresh connections. And now I have a blur. However, the problem is that the blur might work on these layers here now, but this layer is way too sharp still because the blur amount is the same. However, since it's further back, it won't appear as much. So the blur amount has to be much more for this one than for those. So what you can do with these effects, come up to the effects here, go to the Gaussian blur and select the property you want to be converted to comp size. Then I'm going to come up with a menu, and this is only available via the menu. Hold on Control or Command and then click on Convert Property to Comp Size. And now you see already that the blur amount seems much more equal. So I would probably have to set this to 2. And you see that it already makes much more sense the way these layers are being blurred. And if we look on the effects of these layers here, you see that on this layer further back, there is a blurriness amount of 10. And on this layer here, closer to the camera, we have a blurriness amount of 6.4. And on this one here, we have a blurriness amount of 5.6. And there has been an expression applied to the whole thing in order to equalize these values. On the effect of the adjustment layer, there's also this expression here. It says, do not remove this line right expression below. And it tells you that this is a toComp size property. If you want to have an expression on there, you can just remove this property and then add like a wiggle expression. And now that wiggle expression is applied to everything. You can also remove the property toComp size expression by selecting the property, then coming up with the menu, holding Control or Command again, and clicking on Convert Property to Comp Size again. And now this has been removed. You can also use the Convert Property to Comp Size for rotation properties or for position properties. So I have this example here of all these shapes, and they're all at different transforms. So now let me just create an adjustment layer. And I can just use a group adjustment layer in this case. I can also just use the shortcut on Windows, which is Control, Alt, and period. And now all of the contained layers already will be added to my adjustment layer. And now let me just create a drop shadow. And now if I set the distance, you see that it will be completely different for all of the contained layers. It will be at completely random positions as it seems. So now I can go to the drop shadow and I can select all the properties I want to convert to comp size. So in this case, it would be the direction, of course, the distance, and also the softness amount. Then I can come up with the main menu and click on Convert Property to Comp Size. And now, as you can see, all of these values have been equalized. And I can change the distance, and everything will move, at the right position. Also, I can do that with position properties. So if I create a gradient ramp here and I hit refresh connections, now, of course, all of these points here will be also at the wrong position and will look kind of weird. But then I can come up to the properties here, select them both, go to Convert Property to Comp Size. And now they're all at the right position. You can also add several adjustment layers. So in this case here, I have this one correction applied to all the bushes. However, there are still, here it gets brighter only for those layers in front and not the one in the back. So I just want to color correct these three here. What I can do is, create an adjustment layer only for those. And I'm just calling them brighten front. And now adding curves to it and then executing refresh connections. Now I can just color correct those here. All right, and now I can just animate that maybe. And I can also do the same in the beginning. All right, I mean, of course, we all see it certainly doesn't work as a color correction like that, but you kind of get the point. I mean, this is what I'm trying to get at here. And the order of these adjustment layers here is important. So now if we look at, a layer here that is contained in both of these adjustment layers, you see that the brighten front has been added first and the bushes effects have been added afterwards. And this is kind of the logical structure of that. So if you would add a normal adjustment layer, of course, the effects on that layer would be added first and then on that one after that. However, if we move it up here and we execute refresh layout, now if we look at these effects here, you see that the bushes effects are now first, and after that reordered have been the ones of the brighten front adjustment layer. If we come up to a layer, you see that now these effects of these adjustment layers have been added after all the contained effects on the layer. However, it would also be acceptable, let's say you have these effects here after that, and you hit refresh layout, it will still work. However, let's say you have them in between and you hit refresh layout, they will be moved out of there. So the effects on your layer either have to be before the adjustment layer effects or after that. Right now, of course, all of these effects here, they're all referenced by expressions. However, if I don't want that, I can uncheck link properties via expressions and hit refresh connections, or just use the shortcut to unlink the properties. And now you see it has been unlinked. And if I look at the effects here of the bushes adjustment layer, you see that it now has been unlinked. And this, of course, is something you can do after you worked on your effects and you need a better performance. If you want to work on that again, just relink it. If you delete your adjustment layers, you will get these expression errors because, of course, there are still the effects of the adjustment layer that now cannot be referenced. So you would have to execute refresh layout after that, and then they will be removed from your layers. But there's also a quicker way. Of course, you can just use the delete layer clone group function, and now you won't have to hit refresh layout again. In the previous example, I already showed you a little bit about a group adjustment layer. So we can also, of course, do the same thing here. Just select our bushes, create a group, call that bushes. We can just add a group adjustment layer. And now, of course, if we would add a new layer to it. And now if we come up to the adjustment layer of the group, then if we hit refresh connections, it will be added to that. One thing that is different with adjustment layers as compared to clones is that if we are at one of the contained layers and we execute refresh connections, it will tell us that no corresponding clones have been found, because when it comes to contained layers, this will only work with clones. So in this case, we would have to go to the adjustment layer itself and then hit refresh connections. Let's say I don't want this black solid here layer to be included in that, so I can just come up here and where the black solid layer has been added, and I can just disable the effect, and you already see that it's now being excluded. However, of course, the effect is still copied to it. If you don't want it to just execute refresh connections, now the effect cannot be found on the layer where the effect has been disabled here. If you want it to be included again, just enable it, hit refresh connections, and now it's already there. There's also a different mode of adjustment layers in Workflower, which is the matted adjustment layer. And the matted adjustment layer will just create a basic adjustment layer, an After Effects adjustment layer, and it will be matted to the selected layers. So what can this be useful for? The way that the linked adjustment layer works is that it applies effects to the layers. However, there's a certain order in which After Effects applies stuff to the layer. There are the effects, and after that there's the blending mode or the motion blur, for example. But this is not always the way I want the order to be. So let's say I'm compositing an element, I'm enabling the motion blur, but I also have to apply grain to it, in order to make it work within the composite. And in this case, you can use a matted adjustment layer. So the effect will be applied after the motion blur will be applied. So here we have another example where I have this shadow here again. And as you can see, the black value of the shadow doesn't quite match the background. So this is brighter. So if I come up to my shadows here and I would apply curves, and this layer here is set to multiply. So if I turn that up, so I match the black values, I'm also losing the magic of the transfer mode. So let's say I'm there, but I almost have no shadow left here anymore. I hope you can see that on your screen there as well. So what I can do then is go to my panel, hold on Shift, and click on Create Matted Adjustment Layer. Now it will have cloned this layer below using a clone and comp. And then I can apply my curves to that. And as you can see, I can just very easily try to match the black values. Something like that. And I will not have modified the effect of the blending mode in that case. When you add a matted adjustment layer to just one layer, it will always create a clone and comp. If you apply it to multiple layers, it will always create a precomp clone out of all of these layers. So one thing I encounter very often when working on a visual effects shot is that I have this base footage and I need it all the time for all kinds of stuff. To either create like a matte on top of something else, so I can put the background element before, like an object that has to be, in between. Or like in this case I have here, where, what we worked on, we want to create this bump map from, our base footage. And I'm working here, and now I have to go scroll down, find the footage, then copy it, come up here and paste it. And sometimes there are even like some effects on it or some tracking data or something. Then I have to delete again. And it's fine, but it just takes, a little bit of time for something you do so often. So there's the store layer function now. And the way you work with it is you select your layer, then go to the menu and hold on Shift and click on Store Layers. Now, if we look at the project, we see there's a Stored Layers folder here, and we see that the footage has been copied inside of here. And then we can, come up to, the layer we want to paste it above, then come up with the main menu and click on Paste Stored Layers. And now this layer has been pasted there, so it's kind of like an extended clipboard. And of course there is a shortcut. You can also just copy your footage by holding down Ctrl-Shift-6. And now it has been copied there. And I can paste it by holding down Ctrl-Alt-6 or Ctrl-6 on Mac. And now I added that. I can also do that with multiple layers. So just select my layers here, then use the shortcut, and then I can paste it. I can also have multiple store comps. Let's say I want these two layers here, for example. Then I can use the second slot. By default, this slot only exists on Windows, but you can also set it on Mac, and then I'll show you in a second how. Just hold on Ctrl-Shift-7. Now you see a second store comp has been created, and now I can just paste it by using Ctrl-Alt-7. And if you come up to the shortcuts, you see there are 4 possible slots for storing layers, and you can set shortcuts for that.